Hi everyone, I'm Drew Church and I'm a security strategist here at Splunk. I'm part of the team who's working with JupiterOne on this awesome partnership. One thing the team wanted me to talk about is that day in the life of the security analyst. Before joining Splunk, I was a SOC manager and helped my team learn to defend our networks from adversaries. We use Splunk with enterprise security, but one thing we always struggled with was that identifying everything surrounding that event that we were investigating. We and many of our customers today use enterprise security's assets and an identities framework to enrich data and alerts with that environmental context about who, what, when, where. As that shift continues to gain momentum to cloud, it's harder to identify all of those interconnected microservices, infrastructure, and related cloud services across all of the players in the industry. The kind of light bulb moment for me was when I was working through the Splunk app and TA. I was able to pivot directly from investigating a threat in the demo data directly into the JupiterOne console, where I could see that graph database pop with all of the relationships that I didn't know about. The example I had was looking at an infected AWS EC2 instance. If you've ever tried to find all of the assets or resources associated with an EC2 instance in their console, good luck. You're bound to miss at least one, but probably many, many more. By having amazing visualizations and the ability to drill down further, this would have saved my analysts a ton of time during their investigation without flipping between a dozen different tools. I personally really think that our customers are going to enjoy this integration, the partnership, and really want to pass it over to Sam and Akash to dig in deeper so you can really get that moment for yourself.
All right, so we want to show you a little bit about how the JupiterOne add-on and app work within Splunk. And then we're also going to show you how this kind of connects back over to JupiterOne and the additional data that you can, or additional research you can do there, exploration that JupiterOne enables. So let me start on the Splunk side. Once you've installed both the add-on and the app, they'll show up here in your menu. I won't go through the details for the add-on, but that is kind of the base of the integration. That's where you can configure it. That's where you enter your JupiterOne API key and things like that. And then it will also start ingesting the data, bringing it into JupiterOne for you. And what this does is it brings in alerts and the entities associated with those alerts. The way you can view that is by going on to into the JupiterOne app, and you can see we've got a kind of a basic dashboard here. Shows us the active alerts, which have been dismissed. I can view it by severity or those kind of things. And then I can continue to scroll down and look at these. And I want to drill into a couple of them and show you a couple different things. One is if I'm looking at these, I can see these alerts. And if I want to see some of the details behind it, I can click on, one of the alert entities. Maybe if I drill into the users with MFA, it's going to show me a list of all the things here. Now, one thing that we've allowed our customers or joint customers to do is when this data is brought in, or even before this data is brought in, if you don't want to leave your Splunk enterprise account, you want to do all your research here, even using JupiterOne data, we've given you the ability to actually execute a query on JupiterOne data from within your Splunk search bar. So in search and reporting, and you can see in my history, I've got a search here. I can just add this to my search. And what this is doing is it's doing a custom search of JupiterOne. This is a JupiterOne query. And then once I execute that, it's actually in real time going out and pulling the data that matches that query back into my Splunk account. It takes a second here, and you can kind of see this. So that's one use case for Splunk enterprises. You want to bring JupiterOne data in, you can do it that way. Another way is for the data that's already here, back into this app. Let's say I'm doing kind of a day in the life, and I'm looking for some details about an instance of in AWS. And I'm going to drill down to a specific one here that we've done. This is an alert that's brought in some information about hosts that are sharing an SSH key. If I drill down to the details of this and pull up the list of entities that are associated with this alert and expand this out, a couple things to show real quick, and then we'll flip over and show you how this works on the JupiterOne side. But here's a list of all the fields associated with this alert. And for any one of these, I can click on it. In this case, we want to look at this. We know this is the ID that we're going to go looking for, listed here. And so once I find that, if it's the source of this is a JupiterOne entity, I'll have this explore option regardless of the source of the data, I'll always have this search option. And once I click on that, it'll dump me back over into my JupiterOne account, and I'll be able to actually see the results of this search. And so I want to turn it over to Akash now, and he'll kind of show you what happens, where it goes from here once I execute this search in JupiterOne.
Once you were to click that, right, you'll automatically be taken into JupiterOne. And this is what the console looks like in J1. So if, for example, you have been investigating in Splunk and you now want to continue your investigation in JupiterOne, we see that that resource that Sam was pointing to, in this case, AWS instance, we have all these various points of data on it, right? These different alerts and problems we've found, these other properties, like whether it's active when it's created, the architecture, and so on and so forth, many properties about the actual instance. But I think everyone could agree what's even more interesting are these relationships. What is this instance connected to? So it's on, for example, a particular subnet. And I believe we could dig in, obviously, and see what else is on this subnet. But I believe this instance also had a shared SSH key. So, we could go look at its SSH key and see, well, what instance was it sharing with? And it's, this one over here, ProdEFS, that happens to be on the same subnet and so on. So this kind of correlation of information is part of the value of JupiterOne. We are ingesting this data, aggregating it, normalizing it, and connecting it, correlating it in this graph data model that is dynamic, explorable continuously. So we're ingesting this data via API, and this data is readily available for an investigation. When you think about how quickly could we pivot and understand the subnetwork that this instance is on, any other instances on it, shared SSH, here's the VPC, the rest of the route table configurations if we needed them, the ACLs, the security groups that might be protecting this instance, EBS, the ENI, what's the IP address, all this information is just readily available and extremely valuable to a complex investigation, especially in the cloud. So we found that Splunk customers get a lot of value out of being able to pivot into a incident and collect this context as quickly as possible. Now, exploration of this graph is not the only way to get this context. We also have dashboards, like, for example, this incident response dashboard, among other dashboards that we have, that allows you to input a host name, instance ID, or IP address. In this case, I've put in the same instance ID, and then get the various useful context that might be relevant for that particular incident. So in this case, the blast radius. Here again is a more distilled version of the subnet, the two instances, the shared SSH, the security group. But then there's also this extra information of, well, there's actually a Meraki device that has allowed traffic through this virtualized firewall as well. So that's in the blast radius, an extra device that we might not have known about. So very useful. Here are the affected items. Someone could take this to another tool if they wanted to. But we also have alert triggers and monitoring, which I'll get into in a moment as well. But as we can see, the connected resources that we saw before, who has privileged access to the instance and what is that access? What's the internet attack path? What are the firewall rules? What are the roles and permissions that can have access to this? And even other information like what other findings are on this instance, right? Maybe there's findings from Qualys, Rapid7, or from JupiterOne, our configuration scanning. What data does this instance have access to, and so on and so forth. So all of this context around the incident that's so important is readily available. And this would be possible for any host, instance, or IP, not just in AWS, but in Azure or GCP as well. If you dropped in like an Azure VM, you would be able to dig into that, for example, as well. And here's some data on this Azure VM and this very similar blast radius and privileged access and internet path and so on for this workload as well. So I think it's starting to become clear the value of the context for a particular incident, but the other parts of JupiterOne are also quite interesting. So I want to dig into them for a bit. the way we're getting this data is through integration. So we are connecting to a variety of tools and collecting data via API using read-only privileges and just collecting the metadata around the different assets that we monitor, right? So we take a very granular definition of assets. So you'll notice we're going to be pulling in data from code repositories, from HR systems, from MDMs, from EDR systems, from networks, infrastructure systems, from the cloud providers, from your source control, and so on and so forth, vulnerability scanners, and et cetera, identity providers, and so on. So all of these are different assets that have configurations and relationships to one another. And we collect that data into JupiterOne and correlate it together, as we saw, even beyond just the cloud, right? So who has access to the cloud from which devices, which identities, federated access, all of this great context around an incident that can be extremely useful. So the asset definition, as I mentioned, conforms to a particular data model where we normalize this information. So even access keys are assets. So the data model, as I mentioned, conforms to this very granular definition where even things like access keys, policies, containers, applications are all considered assets. And we normalize this data so that something like a data store could be, one of dozens of types of data stores from AWS, Azure, or GCP. And we will allow you to ask a question like, find all my unencrypted data stores, and we'll be searching across all these types at once. So that's part of the value of JupiterOne, is that we're monitoring for those misconfigurations on these broad buckets of assets, but very granularly, right? At a very specific type level and specific classes that are typically not considered assets as well. So I will just pivot into the alerting system to talk about some more of those alerts that you saw Sam had pulled into his Splunk environment. So JupiterOne is not analyzing real-time log event-based time series data. We're really focused on configuration and graph data, the contextual data around an event, what's possible. So to use an analogy, if a system like Splunk was the smoke detector that was going to detect if there was a fire or smoke in a house, JupiterOne would be the blueprints to that house that a firefighter could come and look at and understand what are the egress routes, right? Was this built to code, so on and so forth, while actually, going in to fight the fire, which would be very important information. But we would not be detecting a fire from logs or events and so on. And similarly, we can alert on these misconfigurations. So I think something like S3 bucket, their S3 bucket should have logging enabled, for example. We can specify, hey, here's a bunch of buckets that are not configured as such. Here's a bunch of users without MFA enabled and so on. And the interesting thing here is that from any alert, you can also trigger additional actions like Jira, Snow, so on and so forth, email addresses, Slack messages, SQS, tag the entities, or even webhook to another tool. And we recently integrated with Splunk SOAR as well. So there's an opportunity to connect back to a playbook in SOAR as well. So hopefully this gives you a taste of what this data is useful for, why we ingest it. It plays into the compliance team, as well as the incident response team, the security operations team. But really for the Splunk purposes, we want to focus on that IR use case, which is core bread and butter for our customers, especially the cloud incident response. How can you quickly pivot around everything that's you need to know contextually for a given incident?